Keynote speaker of the evening, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. Mr. Sanyal, the dais is yours.
Introducing our keynote speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who is currently a member of Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Prior to this, he was the principal economic advisor to the Finance Minister for 5 years and the co-chair of the G20's Framework Working Group. Before joining the government, he spent over 2 decades in financial markets and was a global strategist and a managing director at Deutsche Bank. Mr. Sanyal is an alumnus of Sri Ram College of Commerce, Delhi, and attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship in 2007 for his work on urban dynamics. In 2010, he was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos. Mr. Sanjeev is an author of several best-selling books, including Land of the Seven Rivers, The Ocean of the Charn, and most recently, Revolutionaries. He has also published over 200 articles and columns in leading publications. Thank you, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, for accepting our invitation. We take immense pleasure to inviting you to speak to our guests on the topic, India, a Reform Agenda for 2047. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and let me begin by thanking United Way Chennai for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you. Now, I've been told I have 20 minutes to solve all of India's problems, which should be more than adequate. So rather than bore you with long lists of data and my views on what the economy is going to do or not do in the next few quarters or even years, I thought it would be a more fun thing to do, since we are meeting face to face, to give you a flavor of how we in the government think about the long term as far as policy making is concerned. So then, hopefully, when we do whatever we do, you will not think that we are completely crazy. And I think that bears, by now, you would have caught on to the fact that the economic policy team that has run India's economic policy in recent years has a bit of a mind of its own. We don't very often follow the prescriptions that are very often told to us by the sundry global experts, but are likely to chart our own course. But hopefully in the next 19 minutes, I shall convince you that there is some sort of thought behind the madness. Now, the first thing I want to make adequately clear to you is that we are unapologetic supply-siders. What do I mean by this? We essentially believe in an India that is driven by risk-taking, innovation, and creative destruction. Now, this is an article of faith that informs a great deal of the kind of economics that we have done in the last few years. Go back and look at all the reforms we have done. They all fit into this general category. Combine that with a hawk's eye on maintaining macroeconomic stability. So, macroeconomic stability, one part of what we want to do. Second, maintaining the creative destruction, innovation, risk-taking part of the economy. And the third sort of part of the triangle is ensuring that there are safety nets for the poor or those who happen to fall off the edge, and to ensure that certain amount of feed-through passes through from the wealth generation to the very poor, so that absolute poverty is being targeted. Now, all of these are important parts of the triangle that informs the way we think about things. So now let's go back and look at the way we have done policies in the last several years. Among the important policies that we put together, one of the most important was inflation targeting. Why inflation targeting? Because it's one way of ensuring that India's macroeconomic anchor is solid. India used to be historically not an Argentina-type high inflation country, but we used to be a country where inflation used to be in the 8 to 12% range routinely. Sometimes it would be a little bit above or a little bit below that, but by and large, that was where our inflation used to be. Since we introduced the inflation targeting framework about 7 years ago, our inflation has by and large been within the 2 to 6% range that is there, given as mandate to the Monetary Policy Committee. And we managed to maintain that broadly, even during the last 1 year where inflation spiked up. We did go beyond that band for shortly, but even then, we did well enough that our inflation was well below that of pretty much the rest of the world, including developed countries. So this particular thing has worked. At the same time, we put in place the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. We were not afraid to allow very large companies to go through that insolvency process. This includes, incidentally, Jet Airways, which in the middle of COVID went bankrupt. Many dire consequences were predicted, but we went through the process, and the civil aviation sector is in rude health as a result of that. So again, we continue to be very much driven by the idea that there should be continuous churn, continuous creative destruction. Third, we did GST. Yes, when we introduced GST, and there was a lot of friction along the way, it was not unexpected. But what did we do as a result of that? Essentially, India ended up signing a free trade agreement to itself. And so for the first time, we now have a proper integrated common market for the country itself. And on the final end of the triangle, we have tried quite aggressively to try and deal with absolute poverty without getting bogged down in the rhetoric of inequality and envy. So effort has been made to make sure that every household has a toilet, that gas services are provided to the poor, that they have identity, they have bank accounts, and during the period of COVID, we also ensured the safety net in terms of providing 800 million people access to food. And of course, during that period, the business community also faced a lot of trouble. We essentially bankrolled the MSME sector through using, again, safety net in the form of liquidity and a blanket guarantee. Now notice in all of this, we are not spoon-feeding the system. When we say a safety net, this is not about creating entitlements. This is about creating safety nets. This is about creating capacities at the bottom of the pyramid so that they can climb up the steps on their own, ultimately. And this continues to be the basic thinking process that informs us as we go into the future. We continue to be a country that will maintain macroeconomic stability. For example, at this point in time, let me say, if you just went from our supply side thinking, then our economy actually right now is capable of growing at as much as 8, maybe even 9%. So why is it that we are tightening monetary policy here in India to try and restrain it? Because our view is this is not a good time to try and accelerate growth beyond what the rest of the world can deal with. We can grow faster than the 6-7% range that we are in right now, but we would not be able to export to the rest of the world to be able to counterbalance the imports we would get if we were growing faster than this. So what are we doing? We are actually restraining from a macroeconomic responsibility perspective such that we are able to weather this period of slowing global growth. Because this is our judgment at this point in time about the amount of pressure that our external accounts can take at a time when pretty much the rest of the world is slowing down. In fact, very latest numbers will also show you that exports are particularly goods exports are actually declining at this point in time, and therefore we have to make sure that we do not grow so fast as to suck in so much imports that our external accounts begin to wobble. 1 or 2 years with slightly slower growth does not matter. Most importantly, maintain macroeconomic stability. In the same thinking, we continue to look at creating a country where innovation and risk-taking is key to how we make our way into the future. And you may have seen that even at the height of COVID, we continue to carry out structural reforms. We opened up the space sector, we opened up the geospatial sector, we opened up the drone sector, we privatized Air India and kept doing. Why did we do this? Because throughout this COVID period, our view was very clear that the post-COVID world will not be a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. It would involve its own geopolitics, its own technologies, its own consumer behavior, its own supply chains, and so on. Which meant that we should be prepared for a post-COVID world that would be radically different. Now, the problem is, as policymakers, we can't quite make out how that will evolve, because, of course, many things are going to happen. So rather than waste our time trying to work out exactly how the world is going to pan out, what we did is try and open out as much of the economy and make it as flexible as possible so that whatever happened into the future, we would be able to respond to it as best as we could. This is very different from the demand-oriented reflation that the other countries in the world were doing. And of course, as you remember, we came under a lot of flack for doing this particular approach. But the result of this is we have a lot more flexibility in our economy today than we have had in the past. In fact, compared to virtually every other country in the world. And this means that at times we did things that were politically difficult. For example, we tried to do farm reforms. I think as an economist, I still stand by the idea that it was the right thing to do. It may not have been politically palatable, but farm reforms from an economic perspective were the correct thing to do. Having flexibility in our agricultural sector is also necessary. Nonetheless, we have to move on. So what about the next 30 years? I now have about 10 minutes to go, so I shall now turn to what I think should be what we should look forward to. Now, we have gone through 3 decades of reforms. In these 3 decades of reforms, what have we really tried to do? Essentially, what we have tried to do is to withdraw the Indian state from the things it should not do. That is why in the last 3 decades, when we said reforms and we said liberalization, we more or less meant the same thing. Now, the next 30 years has got to be, having hopefully liberated the private sector adequately to do its own thing. I'm sure there's more to do, but by and large, I think the point has been made. We now need to turn to get the Indian state to do the things it should do. So what is it that the Indian state needs to do? Well, the Indian state needs to deliver basic urban services, for example. The Indian state needs to deliver justice. So there are certain sets of reforms that we need to now do, which are critical for getting the Indian state to do this delivery. So let me give you a couple of examples as illustration. So far, the administrative system that we have today and what we have 30 years ago is more or less the same. Progress has by and large been made by reducing the power of the administrative system to interfere with your lives, whether it's in your business life or in your personal life. So it's the same administrative system. But where did this administrative system come from? The bureaucracy essentially was created during the colonial period with a view essentially to control a largely hostile population. Therefore, the purpose of the bureaucracy was essentially control. Now, in 1947, we became free. It should have been the case that after independence, we should have changed the nature of our administration, but we didn't. because we decided for a variety of reasons to adopt a socialist model of growth. We in fact eulogized the Ashokan state, which is also a very interventionist state. And as a result of which we not only maintained but enhanced the powers of our bureaucracy. Now, after 1991, progress was made by withdrawing some of those powers. But no effort was made to effectively get the bureaucracy to think of itself as a service delivery mechanism. What we now need to do over the next 3 decades is to get the administration, the bureaucracy, to think of itself as a public service. And that requires a lot of reform. It's a long discussion, of course, but I want you to say that this is got to be an important area, and one way to start this is to at least have a widespread public debate on the matter. The second big area that we need to reform over the next 30 years has got to be our judicial system. We cannot be a developed society based on markets and contracts if there is no contract enforcement on time, where large parts of our jail system are stuck with under trials whose cases go on forever, far beyond what their original crime is supposed to have been. To be a civilized country, we need a civilized judicial system. And that is another major area that we need to reform. 40 million cases stuck in our judicial system and rising is not the way that we are going to be a developed country by 2047. So another major area that we need to reform. While these we need to do in the longer sort of cycle, let me say there are things that we need to do, continue to do for the time being. And one of them is already in process, which is to radically upgrade our infrastructure so that our own lives as well as our business activities and our competitiveness, etc., gets upgraded to levels that we as a country, as hopefully by the end of this decade, a major global economy should aspire for. And that is a reason that you've seen in the budget. Repeatedly, we have increased the allocation to capital expenditure. From the central government, you may have seen the latest budget ramps it up by 33%, but remember that this is on top of several years of ramping this up. So cumulatively, there's been a dramatic ramping up of infrastructure. Over time, our airports are now world-class for the most part. Some parts of our highway system are getting to be world-class. We will have the 5G rollout. Of course, much of that is from the private sector. Nevertheless, it's going to get rolled out and will hopefully provide you world-class 5G services. Our ports are getting improved, and so on and so forth. So, big ramping up of infrastructure that is happening across India. Much of this so far has been intercity. Now, the next stage has got to be to begin to ramp up infrastructure inside the cities in terms of the way we invest in public spaces, in the way we invest in transit-oriented development, in the way we look after water bodies, and so on and so forth. So this has got to be a major area of work. Another area that we need to pay attention to is also on the environmental front. A lot is said about climate change, and that is indeed important. We need to carry out an energy transition. In fact, we need to do this energy transition even if there was no such thing as climate change, for the simplest reason. We are a country that is not really blessed with hydrocarbons, but we are blessed with sunshine. So even if there was no such thing as climate change, we, as a national strategy, need to make this transition. Of course, this does not mean that we are going to simply abandon coal and gas, etc. overnight. We will maintain a certain mix. But we will make this transition, and for that, a lot of big investments are already happening for things like green hydrogen. You may also have heard that we have just discovered that we happen to be sitting on the third largest reserve of lithium in the world. We didn't know that, evidently, till now, but again, going to help us in that transition. So, a very major area, but there are other areas that we also need to think about on the environmental front. Again, the management of water bodies is a very, very important part of this story. So is how we manage plastics. I don't have too much time left, but let me say that I think the plastics emergency is a very serious one. Plastics are now entering everything. They're entering our food. They're now all inside. Microfibers of plastics are inside our bodies. And this is going to be, in some ways, the health crisis of the 21st century. Our oceans are covered in plastic. Our forests are covered in plastic. Our agriculture is covered in plastic. Our lives are just consumed with plastic. Just like there is now a major response towards carbon-based electricity, I can tell you that before the end of this decade, there's going to be a big backlash against plastics. Again, it is an area where we can play a role by thinking of alternatives. There's investment that has to happen in natural fibers and traditional systems, but also in completely new systems that will replace these plastics. So with that, let me say, since I have almost no time left, that I have hopefully given you some flavor about how we think about policy. The idea here is to tell you that the government is there in order to provide all the resources and space and support that the private sector needs in order to make its way forward into this unknown next 25, 30 years. I do not think the government will provide leadership in the way in the old days you would have, the planning commission telling everybody what to do. That's not how we think about policy making anymore. The role of the government is very clearly to provide leadership where necessary, infrastructure where essential, and to provide you with a stable playing field where you, the private sector, can take this country to where it needs to be, which is, first of all, to be the third largest economy before the end of this decade, and hopefully the world's largest economy by 2047. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.